Nearly 30 years ago, I said goodbye to America after studying at UCLA for 4 years. And at that time I thought I had done with the US. And I did come back to the United States except for professional conferences very briefly until a few years ago. But Professor Jagdish Vyas's enthusiasm brought me here 2 years ago for the first time. And then I realized that America in 1970 and America in 1998 were two different Americas. And that gave me the confidence that the future Sri Aurobindo has been dreaming about is crawling towards perfection. And therefore, probably to come to America and share with Americans my enthusiasm for Sri Aurobindo would be an excellent way of spending my days of retirement. Since then I have been coming almost every year. 2 years ago I was here for nearly 3 weeks in the old residence of Professor Jagdish Vyas. They had just faced a terrible tragedy in their family, and yet they mustered enough courage to host these 10 talks, host a visitor from India. I came last year but spent most of my time on the West Coast, not so much in New York. But this time I'm here in New York, and as soon as Jagdish Bhai learned about it, he was very happy because he was thinking of this center. And I'm happy because this center is coming up. I'm happy not because among the hundreds and thousands of mutts and temples and gurus that we have been importing from India, we have one more temple, one more mutt of which I am a life member. It's not that at all. But I was happy because in a real sense, Sri Aurobindo is not talking in a context where you are either an Indian or an American. He is talking in a situation where you are primarily a human being. You see, our mind, our bodies are Indian. Because you were brought up in India, you like gatiyas, jalebis, etc., etc. Your emotions may be Indian. You like Indian music, you like Ravi Shankar. Your minds may be Indian. Similarly, every American has a right to be an American at the level of the body, emotions, and the mind. But there is something which transcends all these and which is essentially a sign of our humanness. Because in some sense, animals too have a body, animals too have likes and dislikes. They may not have the kind of mind that you and I have, which allows us to do induction and deduction and therefore science and technology. But they too have minds in these various ways. But what distinguishes man, we should not forget, is an evolved inner being, is an evolved soul. That's what characterizes man. And Sri Aurobindo addresses primarily this spark of the divine seated within each one of us, which we call the soul. And at this point, there is no distinction between American, African, Indian, and Aborigines, no matter what you are. You all carry within yourself this spark of the divine. And it is this spark of the divine, he thinks, is the key to man's future and man's success on this terrestrial world. Now here is a message which is of great relevance particularly to American Indians. in the sense not American Indians, the Indians who were here before America came into being, but what I'm saying, Indians who have settled in America. Because Sri Aurobindo brings a new teaching, a teaching which may have its roots in the Indian tradition, but which is not limited to India. A teaching which probably can be realized much more fully, much more integrally in America than in India. A teaching where India has as much a role to play as America has. So this is a very exciting prospect for before human beings that he has placed. And it is that has enthused me. It is that which has taken me to Savitri. And it is that which takes me year after year to various places within India and to various parts of the world. And whoever wants to share this view, this vision, the delight of this view and vision, invites me. I'm always available, whether I have an audience of 1 or an audience of 1,000. It doesn't matter to me at all. This is why I am here, to share with you not my scholarship, because I have never been a philosopher, nor was I ever a student of literature. I taught at a university, but my subject was linguistics, which had nothing to do with either philosophy or literature. It's something totally different. So what I have brought to you, or what I bring with me, is my enthusiasm and my great love for the vision and truth that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother represented and gave to mankind. Now, Jagdish Bhai has given me a task which I find very difficult to perform, and which is, within 3 talks, he had already heard me 10 days. He listened 2 years ago. And many people must have listened to my talks in Pondicherry, where I take a canto and devote 3 days, 4 days, 5 days just to a canto. And here I am supposed to cover the entire corpus, all these 24,000 lines, and also in doing that, tell you something about Sri Aurobindo's life, his vision, what he stands for, and why eventually you need this. You need a foundation here, you need a center here. Why do you need all these things? This is the brief given to me, and I will see what I can do to fulfill Jagdish Bhai's wishes. I have always found 1.5 hours a little too long for most people to concentrate, particularly the subject is philosophy. So I do understand problems, so I may take a break maybe after 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and again we assemble and continue. So if I suddenly stop, please don't panic, I'm reasonably healthy, I can continue for 1.5 hours. But I think our concentration span is after about 45 minutes, it begins to lag. So I may take a break. It much depends on how I feel. Now, one of the things I would like to say, particularly to Indians here, is that Sri Aurobindo is not very well known even in India. Very often I have to go to universities and give an introductory talk about Sri Aurobindo, who Sri Aurobindo was. They have heard about Sri Arvindanath Tagore. There are people who have heard about Arvindanath Tagore, who lived in Pondicherry, which is somewhere in West Bengal. That's the kind of understanding people have. That is because Sri Aurobindo's greatness was of a peculiar kind. You see, if you have a doctor who gives you first aid when that help is necessary, you remember him because he came when he was needed. Or there may be a social worker who pleads your cause before a certain authority, or there may be a political leader, there may be a chief minister, mayor, etc. And the work that they do you can see, but you don't always remember the contribution of great scientists. You don't know what they have done. But since more and more people are now science oriented, we are in a position to appreciate what scientists have done for mankind. But if they stood for any kind of political race, I don't think scientists would ever win, except in a country where most people are science conscious. So we remember people who are in the front. So in India, people know about Mahatma Gandhi, people know about Indira Gandhi, and most people believe India's freedom struggle began with Mahatma Gandhi, ended with Indira Gandhi. That's the kind of understanding people have about Sri Aurobindo. I won't go into it because there isn't much time. But suffice it to say that Sri Aurobindo's early education was entirely British. He was brought up in England until the age of 21, from the age of 7 to 21. And he knew no Sanskrit, no Bengali, no Indian language whatsoever. He went to Cambridge, did his tripos, classical tripos, on the basis of his great prowess in turning out Greek poetry, Latin poetry, for which he used to win every prize, including English poetry and so on. It is that kind of a background from which he came. And he suddenly decided after clearing the examination, the ICS. The ICS was in those days annex to heaven. If you can't go to heaven, the nearest thing you can do is ICS for Indians. So it cleared the ICS, but for very reasons we can't go into at the moment, he discovered that the British imperialism was a great evil and was sucking the blood of the Indian people. And he can't be expected to be a tool of British imperialism. And so he decided to get out of the ICS. But as I always make a joke of this, if you fail an examination, next year you can pass it. But if you pass an examination, you can't do anything to fail it. That was his problem. So it already cleared the ICS among the most successful candidates, among the first 5 or 6. There are records where the examiners have said, particularly English essay and Greek and so on, they haven't seen better papers in their entire career as examiners in the ICS. That kind of a background. But he decided to quit the ICS because what is called the freedom struggle bug had already bitten him. And he had started making very fiery speeches at a student organization called the Lotus and the Dagger and so on. And the British government also knew this, so they were very happy to get rid of him, and Sri Aurobindo obliged them by not clearing the writing test. And so he did the Cambridge tripos, didn't wait long enough to get the degree. He did the ICS, but didn't want to belong to the ICS. So he went through all the process of education but didn't want a degree. In India it's now the other way around. People want a degree but no education. In Sri Aurobindo it's totally different. He had all this education but he didn't wait for the degree. He came back to India. He became a professor in Baroda College, and he was there for many, many years. So that's one thing that the Gujaratis are very proud of, because Sri Aurobindo made his first home in Baroda in India. And when he came to India, he basically did 3 things. First thing he did, of course, was to educate himself in Indian languages. He studied Sanskrit, he studied many Indian languages, including Gujarati and Bengali. He knew a smattering of Marathi and so on. And second thing, of course, was he wanted to lead a revolutionary struggle against the British. And at that point, Indians were so spellbound by the British and their skin and their English and their manners, etc., etc. Sri Aurobindo asked this very simple question: how many of us are there in India? And India, of course, has always had this unique distinction. We have a vast population. And how many British soldiers are posted in India? And in those days, maybe 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. Even to send reinforcements to India from England, it used to take 3 months. So he said, within 3 months, if 10, 15, 20 Indians surrounded each British Tommy, lifted him, we can get rid of all the British, either throwing him in the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea. Or what I'm trying to simplify this little bit. He said it was very easy for the Indian nation to take on this small number of 30, 20, 40,000 Tommies. If after the nuclear age dawned, the mightiest military power called the United States, when they entangled themselves with Vietnam, you know what happened. If that can happen in the 1960s, in 1893 when Sri Aurobindo came back to India from England, we could have easily gotten rid of Indians, of the British. But Indians said, how can we do it? Look at them, their complexion is almost godlike, their English is beautiful, they have very nice manners, like us, they don't eat with hands, they use. So we're all praised and we regard it as kind of my Baap government. It's a government, God, we must, pray to Tirupati God, etc., that they have given us such good rulers. I don't blame Indians because before the British came, the governments they saw were not any friendlier than what the British were. They had about 1,000 years of various kinds of Islamic marauders, one after the other, except for a brief period of stability during the Mughal period. And that also, the boundaries of each kingdom varied day to day. That was the kind of political uncertainty in which people lived. And the British brought the sense of political unity, British brought the sense of purpose, rule of law, etc., etc. So most Indians were very happy. Now it is this country, to this country, which was not even aware of the fact that the freedom, something so basic as freedom had been taken away from them, that these people had to be awakened. It's like people were kind of intense, deep tamas, sleeping very deeply, and so the Congress government movement at that time was going down on your bent knees and praying to the British government so that your uncle can be a mamlatdar, little tehsildar, somebody can be a police sub-inspector, can we get all these things? At that time, to make Indians say, freedom is our birthright and I must have it, 1906 in Surat Congress, the voice, the vocal cords were Tilak's, but the spirit, the dynamism, the inspiration behind it came from Sri Aurobindo. Because Sri Aurobindo never believed in playing occupying the stage. He always preferred to work from behind the scene, and he was the one who enthused Tilak to do this. And I have read what people like Acharya Kripalani had to say. Acharya Kripalani, as you know, was a very, very close associate of Mahatma Gandhi, or Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, or Subhash Chandra Bose. If you read their lives, their autobiography, they have very clearly said, our inner life was entirely made by the writings of Sri Aurobindo. The whole generation was prepared by Sri Aurobindo, a generation which was prepared to pay any price for India's freedom. And it is to this generation that Gandhi addressed when he came from South Africa. And so, if Sri Aurobindo had not preceded, if Sri Aurobindo had not done this spade work of preparing the inner life of the country, I don't think Gandhi's call would ever have received adequate response. Furthermore, when he was editing one of the journals that he was editing at that time, he wrote a series of articles called Passive Resistance. Even now, if you read these articles, Passive Resistance, you will find this is a textbook of Gandhian non-cooperation. Gandhi didn't have to borrow tools from anywhere else, but Sri Aurobindo had given them ready-made, and all that he had to do was to apply them, which Gandhi did, and make it a movement which was of the classes, make it a movement of the masses, which Gandhi did, and freedom came. Now, Sri Aurobindo, the British government tried very often, 3 times, to make sure that Sri Aurobindo is either put behind bars or sent out of the country, or if possible could be hanged, because they had seen that this was the most dangerous Indian. The most dangerous in India at that time was Sri Aurobindo. And there was an Alipur bomb case. We won't go into it in detail. And because of that, they said, if there is, Alipur is close to Calcutta, and if anything of that kind happens, it must be Sri Aurobindo's inspiration. So arrest him. They arrested him put him behind bars for a full year. At the end of that year, they couldn't find any evidence against Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo was acquitted. This was in 1909. In 1910, suddenly, Sri Aurobindo disappeared from the political scene and went to Pondicherry. I won't go into these details. And he went to Pondicherry in 1910 and lived there until 1950. He left his body in 1950. So what did he do during these 40 years? He has remained a mystery for most Indians, and most political leaders of that time have said probably Sri Aurobindo was lost in some kind of spiritual bliss, some kind of ananda, whatever, and he was indifferent to the nation's freedom struggle, nation's problems, etc. And Jawaharlal Nehru himself writes in a book, he says, when Mahatma Gandhi came to India and gave the call for freedom, we expected a freedom struggle, non-cooperation, we expected Sri Aurobindo would come out of his retirement from Pondicherry. That he didn't do so disappointed us a great deal. And so, all American, Indian professors, university professors, everybody last 50 years, as you know, the so-called Nehru era, all the time marginalized Sri Aurobindo. If at all they took any name, he was called a Hindu fundamentalist like Vivekananda. So anybody who says any sense in India becomes a Hindu fundamentalist. this is the whole story, and we lapped it up, and this went on and on and on. BJP is doing several things which are very wrong, but the one thing right they are doing is they are removing these people from important positions. People who have kind of hijacked the Indian freedom struggle. Indian freedom struggle, if you go back to the Indian freedom struggle, it was basically inspired by people like Ramakrishna Paramahansa. Ramakrishna Paramahansa I would regard as the founder of India's Renaissance. So after Ramakrishna Paramahansa came people like Tilak, then came people like Gandhi, that's the third generation. The fourth step was Jawaharlal Nehru. And so from a spiritual orientation, it got an entirely leftist orientation. This is what I call, therefore, India's spiritual agenda was hijacked. And one of the people responsible for it, I won't emphasize this point, was Mahatma Gandhi himself. Because he made the spiritual movement totally moral. And once you make it moral, then it doesn't take the next stage. It becomes, after that, it became Nehru's leftist movement, etc., etc. This is what happened. And it is because of this. Those of you who went to school in India and studied in Indian colleges, universities, probably had very little to read about Sri Aurobindo. Even now, history books may have small paragraphs, Now that everything is being revised, you have a whole chapter on Tilak, a whole chapter on Lala Lajpat Rai. These were the people who in fact built the freedom struggle, built up the movement. And so Sri Aurobindo was doing all these things. Now I am not saying this to emphasize Sri Aurobindo's role in the freedom struggle. I am raising this as a background to something much more important I am going to talk about. And that is, a man for whom India's freedom struggle was so paramount, so important. In one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo wrote to his wife, he clearly says, "My one madness is India. I want India to be free, I want India to be prosperous, I want India to regain lost glory, I want India to find the place that she deserves in the comity of nations." A man who always said this, and who said, "I am willing to pay any price for it," he suddenly disappeared in 1910, went into retirement in Pondicherry. Several attempts were made to bring him back. In 1920, they were holding a special session of All India Congress in Nagpur, and one of Tilak's associates wrote to him, "We don't have any leader to preside over the Nagpur session, why don't you come out?" Many such letters were written, and Sri Aurobindo patiently wrote back to them explaining why he is unable to move out of Pondicherry, because the work that he has taken up will take many more years to complete. Now this is something that not many people understand. What is it that Sri Aurobindo was doing in Pondicherry from 1910 to 1950? Particularly because if you say, if you go in terms of the traditional Indian yogas, even before going to Pondicherry, Sri Aurobindo had achieved some of the highest siddhis. As you know, when he was in Baroda, he had, first he started pranayama. Sri Aurobindo had no faith in spirituality. He had no faith except as an ICS student of the ICS. He had to read one of Max Muller's books, Max Muller's translations of Indian scriptures. And when he read about the Upanishads, he came again and again to this word Atman. And he was very curious about this word Atman. What could this Atman be? He had this, he made a mental note, but he was too busy with other things, didn't do much about it. Came to Baroda, and there, of course, the first thing that attracts people to yoga is, of course, health, right? If you want to relieve of stress, if you have gastric problem, this problem, that problem, take to yoga. And Sri Aurobindo also took to yoga, basically pranayama. And he did pranayama for a couple of years. Every day he would spend about 4 hours doing pranayama, and he had written that it helped a great deal. It made me feel more energetic. My poetic output increased, but I found no spiritual benefit from it. There are other kinds of benefits, but no spiritual benefits. So at that time, a Maharashtrian yogi called Lele taught him what is called the process of silencing the mind. I won't go into this in any detail. And when Lele taught him, at the end of 3 days, Sri Aurobindo achieved what is called the silence of the mind. Silence of the mind is not peace of mind. It is something totally different. It is called nirvana, where the mind is totally annihilated and the world that mind creates completely disappears. It's that kind of an experience. And Sri Aurobindo was immersed in that kind of experience for months and months and months. And during this period, he was not in retirement. He was in busy political work. And he had a meeting to address in Pune, a meeting to address at Chowpatty in Bombay. You know how Indian meetings are, political meetings, tens of thousands of people gather. And his mind was completely blank. There was nothing at all in the mind because he was going through the experience of nirvana. So he said to Lele, now what do I do? I can't just, I'm not in retirement, I'm in actual political work. What do I do? Lele said, don't worry. When your name is called out, you stand up, look at the audience and make a pranam and wait. Wait for what? So just wait and see what happens. If you have ever been, even if you are a matriculate in India, you won't accept this suggestion. So how? But here was somebody who had gone to Cambridge, right? And when Lele said this, implicitly obeyed. And when this happened, and his name was called out, he stood up. Then he realized the whole Niagara, as it were, of inspiration flew through him. Whole speech came out, appropriate words, appropriate sentences. And he said somewhere that Lele taught me that knowledge doesn't reside at the level of the mind. Knowledge resides at levels beyond mind. Only the mind should know how to access it. The mind should know how to receive it. And this was proved when Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry started writing articles for the Arya. There is a journal called the Arya, monthly, 64 pages. And if you look up any issue of the Arya, you will find Sri Aurobindo attempting 7 different books simultaneously. I don't think this miracle has happened anywhere in the world at any time. A writer trying to write 7 different books at the same time. In any issue of the Arya, if you take it up, you will find chapter 23 of Life Divine, chapter 18 of Essays on the Gita, chapter 3 of Human Unity, chapter 5 of future poetry, which is the history of English poetry, etc., etc. He was writing these books and he went on doing it for 7 long years. If, as we do, it was cogitation, thinking, sitting in an easy chair, constructing an argument, consulting books, libraries, I don't think he would have been able to do it. All that he did was accessing this knowledge, lending his mind. His mind was a very trained, efficient mind. You need to train your mind to be able to access this knowledge and use it. The mind should not be allowed to atrophy. The mind was a very powerful instrument and received this, and all this came out into what is now about 30 books, Aurobindo's corpus in the latest issue, which is on the 125th birth year. They are bringing out a fresh edition of all of Aurobindo's works. They are going to 35 volumes. Out of these 35 volumes, at least 25 were written in these 7 years of the publication of the Arya. Now I am jumping ahead in the story. The point I want to raise simply is, a person who had given so much prominence to his country, its freedom, its prosperity, why did he just disappear? Is it because, as many people have suspected, that he was spellbound by some yogic realization of peace and silence, etc.? So what is it? Well, one of the reasons why Savitri is of great value, this book Savitri we are going to talk about, is of great value is simply that this is an autobiography of Aurobindo in parts. Savitri has 3 parts to it. Part 1, which is called Ashwapati's Yoga, is basically Aurobindo's autobiography. And it is here, in this part, he very clearly tells us what exactly he was doing for 40 years in Pondicherry. Now, since we don't have time to do this, let me very briefly say what it is that he was trying to do according to his own words. You see, it was true that India had no freedom. India was economically deprived. India was steeped in deep tamas. All true. This was true at that time, 1910. You see, a yogi, once he takes to yoga, it's not that his fund of knowledge increases. Yoga doesn't come by reading all the books in the Library of Congress, by reading all the Upanishads and the Vedas and the Gita, etc. That's not the way the yoga comes. Yoga is a new birth of your own inner being. It's a process by which you transcend the ego and go beyond it. So yoga has a very peculiar way of cleansing your doors of perception. You see, when you see the world outside, what you are really seeing is yourself. We don't understand this. And that is why the world is full of quacks. We have quack doctors who would like to bring salvation to the world. You just follow this system, everything will be solved. And very often I am reminded of a illustrious, not an illustrious, but son of an illustrious person, Tolstoy's son. You know Tolstoy? Tolstoy was a great Russian novelist. His father had left him enough money, so he went on, became a globetrotter, and he had a one-item agenda of reforming the world, changing the world. What is it? Very simple. All men in the world should dress alike, and all women should dress alike. So he said everybody had the same dress, human beings will not quarrel anymore. There will be peace and harmony in the world if you have the same t-shirts or the same whatever, And most of our economic and social reformers are as quixotic as Aristotle's son, except that they couch their learning or whatever into very learned terms that accepted in Harvard and Princeton, etc., etc. But basically it's the same thing. Now, Sri Aurobindo, when he realized, when he went through this process of yoga, first of all he had the experience of nirvana. And when he was in Alipur jail for a year as a prisoner under trial, so not under trial, prisoner. Of course, in those days, the British didn't have A class, B class, C class prisoners. There were no, these days, Lalu Yadav is very happy to go into prison because he has peace to do what he wants and he has first class. There are no days. If you read a most hilarious book which Aurobindo had written without any rancor, he has written a book called Prison Tales, his own life in the prison. And you will see in those days how horrible the life of prisoners was, whether you were a political prisoner or a cheat or a murderer, there was no distinction, all of them were the same kind of treatment. When he was in that kind of a jail, he began what he says, the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, the end of it all, before his term was finished. One fine morning he looked out the window where there used to be a banyan tree and he expected to see the banyan tree. But what did he see? He didn't see the banyan tree. He saw Vasudeva himself standing in the place of the banyan tree. His feet were on the ground and his head in the sky, his arms akimbo. He was looking at him. Tree. He said, is something wrong with my eyes? What has happened? Hallucination or what? Then he was taken to the dining room of the prison where there are a number of other prisoners standing in a line. Many of them were cheats and murderers, etc., whom we call corrupted people. But he saw each one of them was Vasudeva himself. Each one of them was Lord himself. He came back to his room and lay down on the coarse cumble that the prison authorities had given. He felt he was sleeping on the laps of Vasudeva himself, and the Vasudeva had embraced him. That's the kind of experience he had. This is the experience of what is called the immanent Brahman. Brahman everywhere. One is the nirvanic experience, and the other experience is nothing exists in this world which is not a manifestation of the Supreme Lord. That's what all scriptures have told us, but we don't ever experience it, and he experienced it. After all these experiences, all that remained for Sri Aurobindo really was to go around like me all over the world giving talks. Instead of that, he went to absolute retirement into Pondicherry. Why? Well, the reason simply is, Sri Aurobindo realized India had problems. But India's problems, he realized, were an Indian manifestation of a much deeper problem. See, when you're India's problems, you come to America. Does America have no problems? You ask any American. They had all these multiple cars and houses and gadgets, etc. They also their problems. You go to Russia, they have a third set of problems. You go to England, they have another kind of problems. So all these problems are a peculiar manifestation of a basic fundamental problem. And so he realized, if India got freedom, that will not be the end of problems, that will be the end of one set of problems, the beginning of another set of problems. And he knew the temper of the country, and he had predicted if India becomes free, the first 50 years will be characterized by Gundaism, nepotism, and Bolshevism. This is exactly what we have in India. 50 years, we celebrated 50 years of independence. Unfortunately, this is what we had. He knew this. So it's not as if India didn't have freedom and that was the only problem. If you have money, you have another kind of problems. The kind of problems you have, American young people go to India looking for peace, looking for harmony, looking for this. So everywhere you find there are problems. So Sri Aurobindo said, concentrating all my efforts only on one thing, getting India freedom, we are not solving India's freedoms. What we need to solve is a more fundamental problem, of human ignorance, of man's bondage to death, incapacity and ignorance. Can this be solved? Can this problem be solved? This was his problem. In other words, let us say you are living in a town and every year you get an epidemic in a particular season. There are doctors who give first aid, there are doctors who give you various kinds of medication, etc. And after 1 month or so, the epidemic has passed away and everything is fine. Again next year the epidemic comes. Again we start all these things. There is somebody who sits and says, why should this epidemic come at all? Is there any remedy to see that this epidemic doesn't come? That was Aurobindo's question. Why is it that in spite of our best efforts, all human ideals, whether it is Marx, Marx for me is one of my saints. If I ever put Hall of Fame, where I have got all the pictures of saints, Marx should be there. Because he, poor man, he struggled for ordinary average man. And he wanted the proletariat, paradise for the proletariat. What did he create? He created a nightmare. Gandhi wanted to create a country of peace and freedom where Hindus and Muslims are bye-byes. But we had rivers of blood. Leave alone Hindus and Muslims by being bye-bye, and Sikhs and Hindus became almost sworn enemies for a while. Now this Mahatma Gandhi, a man who had invested so much energy, tapasya, into this task, if at all, he must have died a very disappointed man. What was happening now, Kali, what was happening in Delhi, everywhere. Now, is it Mahatma Gandhi's fault? Is it Karl Marx's fault? Now in the United States, they have everything. And they have everything in such abundance. But before you get married, you worry about what will happen when you separate. So you first of all go and ask your lawyer. I understand, I have not lived this life. This is stories I get from friends. Must be exaggerated. People always exaggerate about other people. But what I am trying to say is, wherever you see this, you will always find there is some problem. The land that Christ walked, talking about brotherhood and love, Lebanon. Look at the suffering that country has gone through. What happened to all this teaching? So Aurobindo knew this, that we always have great ideals, but these ideals never get fulfilled. Is there a way out for it? What is the way out? Science and technology have come to us as such a blessing. But you already know the disasters that we have made science and technology an instrument of. Ozone law, we were talking about that. We are talking about ecological disaster. We are talking about toxins going everywhere. It seems there was a report in the Time magazine some years ago that the fertilizers that people use have not only ruined the land, but they have also ruined the animals or beings living in forests. So even when you eat fish, you are getting, your body gets toxic. And if this continues, there is a suspicion that man may lose his capacity to reproduce himself. At least it might go down by 20-30%. Suppose this happens to Sweden, already they are suffering from. They are giving paternity leave for people to encourage the growth of population, etc. This might be useful in India, but not anywhere else. The religion. Religion is such a gift from God to man. Religion is what civilized us from animals to human beings. But what has religion done? It has also, as the British philosopher said, writer said, we have enough religion to kill one another, not enough religion to love one another. the story of science and technology. This is the science of religion. Whose fault is it? Oh no, we will have tomorrow a slightly better program. You don't know, yes, but I have a much better program. I will change the whole world. Day after tomorrow, you also have the same result. So Sri Aurobindo is asking, is it possible to change this scenario? Religion give you fulfillment. Religions give you peace. But where? On the other side of death. It's a kind of a check. Religions give you a check, a blank check. You can put any figures. 10 billions, 1 billion, 2 billions. But where is the bank? Where it will be honored? On the other side of death. So when you go there and you find there is no such bank, there is nothing you can do about it. So there is, there is an assumption behind all religions that the perfection of God, even wherever it exists, it cannot exist here and now for you and me. It can only exist on the other side of death. And what can you do here? You can practice, you can improve your competence to enter that world after death. And Sri Aurobindo said such a religion is not acceptable to me either. So on the one hand, technology and all that was not acceptable to him, and what he was doing, nor was religion acceptable to him. And yet he believed, if God created this world, it must have a purpose. It can't be just that after these 15 billion years, from a handful of dust, God created man, who has already been to the moon, who is now thinking of sending his great-grandchildren for a holiday in somewhere up there. And we are supposed to believe that all this is a hoax, is a bunkum, this all to be thrown into the waste paper basket of nature, and we pack our soul into cellophane or whatever and then go up there and present it to God. I have brought my soul here. God says to me, I sent you down for a certain purpose. What did you do to that purpose? I gave you a body, I gave you a mind, I gave you emotions. Sir, I found them all a nuisance. Sri Aurobindo said, most philosophers spend their time finding fault with God. And they are all apologists for God. Well, God has done a number of wonderful things, but small little things he has done, you just ignore them. This world, according to scientists, is a series of accidents. According to philosophers, religious philosophers, this world is a mistake of God. Only for Sri Aurobindo, this world is a miracle, gradually unfolding and reaching its fulfillment. Why was he able to say this? Because he made a very, very important discovery, not made by any religion, when he spent 40 years in Pondicherry. And he not only made this discovery, it's not enough to make discoveries. It's not enough to rate great siddhis. We had Yajnavalkya, we had Vishwamitra, we had Vasishtha, but we still have Lalu Yadavs. We still have untouchability, we still have exploitation. In a land of Yajnavalkya, in the land of Vasishtha and Vishwamitra, we built a social life of which you and I must be ashamed. 50 years ago, 60 years ago in Kerala, when Brahmins walked the road, the untouchables were not allowed even to occupy the road, they had to go down the road. And we are very proud of an ancient civilization, a glorious civilization. The way we treated our women for 1,000 years is a great shame on us. Very often people ask me, Why is it India has a population problem? I said it is not a population problem, it's a load of bad karma. For 2000 years, we prayed the songs of praise. Oh, this is Mata, Supreme Mother, Aditi, Goddess, etc., etc. We had verses where women who is not worshipped, Lakshmi won't come into that house, all these things we said. We burned young women who lost their husbands. We ill-treated widows. Now, if a country ill-treats its women in whatever way, that nation, that country has to bear the load of karma. And in a country where a woman is either a caterer to your dining table or a caterer to your bedroom, you can be sure that you will have a population problem. So, this is our ancient culture and this is what it is. And so, Sri Aurobindo said, what is it, what the country will gain if I have a great spiritual height like Vishwamitra and Yajnavalkya? How will ordinary people benefit from that? On the other hand, the achievement of science is wonderful. Because if you know how to generate electricity, it doesn't ask are you a Brahmin or are you Indian or are you Muslim, or no question is asked. Whoever has the capacity, whoever has the know-how can produce electricity and enjoy the benefits from it. So Sri Aurobindo said, if there is a great secret which I have discovered and that secret remains so unachievable for the ordinary human beings, then it will remain out of everybody's reach. I always talk about it. 3 years ago I used to tell this story. There is a story about the great musician Tansen. There is a story that when Tansen sang a particular rag, Deepak rag or whatever, lights came on by themselves. You didn't need electricity, you didn't need oil, you didn't need anything at all. So all the lights came on. Suppose this is a fact, and not an exaggeration, a fact. How many Tansens have we produced? Until recently, Chandrababu Naidu, Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, was looking for Tansens because there was not enough electricity. Where are these people? So Sri Aurobindo not only made sure, asked this question whether there is a way out for mankind, where God's purpose in creating this universe is fulfilled, where man now, a half beast and half God, can fully assert his status here as a God, walk this earth as God. Is that possible? Not for himself alone, but whoever has done the tapasya for it. Is it possible? This was the question that occupied Sri Aurobindo and the mother for 50 years. Mother spent 50 years asking this question and doing tapasya for it. And it is that tapasya, that vision, that you find inside. So I think I promised you a break. This may be the time for a break. Gotten what the Americans call the bottom line, which is you have to leave in good time so that you can reach home. And if this isn't mood enough for you to want to come tomorrow. Because if I go on and on, tomorrow you may have second thoughts, this man just keeps us engaged for a much longer time. So I will take him 15 minutes, yeah?
While we are here, I thought maybe you will take a little longer time so that the time which we spend in committee.
Yeah, but Friday nights are something unique to America because I have been to midnight sales and so on, so I don't know.
We don't have none of it, but
That's only around the Christmas time.
Not only the Christmas time, okay. Yeah, now I don't want to go on and on because what I want to do today is basically I have reviewed Sri Aurobindo's life, talked about some of the highlights, and what it is that he was seeking, and that I've emphasized, he was not seeking for anything for himself, and he was not a yogi whose yoga was irrelevant to the world. As you know, when Hitler's Second World War started, Sri Aurobindo was the only yogi who raised his voice, who made a contribution to the war chest. And he said, Hitler is our common enemy. I don't care whether you are British or French or whoever you are, as long as you're a human being, we must fight Hitler. Because what was happening to this world was of great relevance to Sri Aurobindo's yoga. You see, generally we get a feeling, yoga is something very private. We do in our rooms, in our study room, in ashram, etc., etc. If it is just that, if it is not related to the world, then that yoga has very little to recommend itself. Yoga must relate to you, relate yourself, to relate you to the world and what's going on in the world. And this is the most important thing about Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And at that time in India, as you know, the British were our enemies, and Hitler was the enemy of the British, and so the enemy of the enemy becomes your friend. And so there are many, many people who are very, very favorably disposed towards Hitler. And you know what Mahatma Gandhi wrote to Churchill at that time? He wrote to Churchill, please don't resist the Germans. After all, what do they want? They want your buildings, they want your land, they want your empire, give it to them. Then start a satyagraha against them. It's good. One thing I recommend Churchill very strongly for is he just disregarded Gandhiji's advice. Because Churchill was no respecter of satyagrahas. Churchill was a totally different kind of person. Sri Aurobindo knew who Churchill was. And he asked all his disciples, whoever was in a position to join the war effort. And many of Sri Aurobindo's disciples joined the army as fighters, as doctors, as engineers, etc., etc. Because he identified Hitler as one of the asuras who come down to this world, earth from time to time, to put back the clock of man's advance towards God. This world, whatever it may look like, is not, as I said, it's not a useless thing, it's not an accident, it's not a series of accidents as many scientists have been talking to us. It's a miracle gradually growing towards God. Because as you can see, how did this world begin? This world began, as our scientist friends tell us, 15 billion years ago with the Big Bang or whatever. And after that, for several billion years, there was nothing here but a whirl of energies. The whirl of energies, the force was so tremendous that the sun couldn't be formed, an atom couldn't be formed. It took several billion years before even the atom could be formed and the sun could be formed, and out of this total chaos of energies, creation could come. And after creation came, there was nothing in this world which was living. There was not even a blade of grass, not even a tree, nothing whatsoever. And if you and I were here at that time, suppose by some imagination, you can bring yourself to here. Now here one day Jagdish Vyas will buy a house and there will be Sri Aurobindo Yoga Foundation, we will all meet here, we have a visiting person from India who will give a talk here, etc., etc. This is unimaginable. This was a dead world. Lo and behold, out from this dead world came plants and trees. Now this is not my story. This is a story I have learned at the feet of the scientists. Then came trees, plants, all kinds of vegetation. The whole world became Sasya Shamanam. And out of that came unicellular life. Life became more and more complex, more and more complex, more and more complex, several billion years. We destroy in 1 year several species, but nature took several billion years to build this universe. Then came at a long last, finally man. And scientists have said if you compress the history of these 15 billion years into 24 hours, let us say, for just to see when man came, and let us say the history of this world is compressed between 12 midnight yesterday and 12 midnight today, man was born 5 seconds before midnight today. That is why we have been here for such a long, short period of time. And so we already think we have reached our senility. It's not our senility, we are still in our childhood. A lot of growth has to be put in, and Aurobindo asked this basic question. If out of chaos creation can come, and out of a dead world life can come, if from life mind can come. Now look at it. If you really look at the whole thing, this looks like as if the whole world, the whole creation is in yoga. What happens in yoga? What is the basic truth about yoga? What happens in yoga, the basic truth about yoga is not that you stand in your head or you hold your nose or you do this, you do that. Your consciousness begins to unfold faculties, levels which it never had before. That's what it basically happens to yoga. As you grow in yoga, your consciousness becomes finer and finer, and more faculties begin to blossom there. The man you hate today, tomorrow you begin to love because you have become a yogi. That's the kind of thing you have. Your imagination, your sympathies, everything begins to expand. And you begin to comprehend and embrace the whole world. That's what a yogi does. Love for him is not just a word, it's a mood of being. How does that happen? That happens because his consciousness gradually expands and grows. This is yoga. Now when Darwin in the 19th century brought out this origin of the species, and suddenly most Christians realized that what the Bible was saying was nothing but a fairy tale. But I think not only was the Bible a fairy tale, I think the Upanishads also have a fairy tale, and Quran has a fairy tale. All scriptures have fairy tales because it is very difficult to put into words what God, who can't be put into words, did. So we all need stories. So Bible has one story that's as valid as any other story. But these people believed these biblical stories literally. And suddenly here was Darwin who was saying, man was not created by God, he descended from a monkey, ape. And suddenly Europeans lost their faith in religion. As you lose interest in woolen clothes after winter is over and begin to throw them, so everybody started throwing their religion. And so churches are available even now. If you want to convert them to hotels, you just go to Europe, any number of churches are available. This is what happened. Now the same evolution, theory of evolution, Aurobindo uses it and says, evolution is nothing but nature's yoga. As in yoga, higher and higher faculties begin to blossom. The whole nature is in yoga. At first time there was nothing here. Then came manifested life. Then manifested mind. Then manifest higher and higher faculties. And what is the ultimate? The ultimate is God's consciousness. Now who are you and me to say that nature has reached a dead end? Nature cannot evolve any further. I don't see there is any logic, any argument for this kind of a thing to say, oh, nature has done everything. If it had to do these things, it would have happened. Monkeys must have said the same thing. Oh, we are the apex of creation, no other creation is ever possible. Can any being be more beautiful than us? Monkeys. Look at our bushy tail, look at our capacity to jump from one tree to another tree. Which being can be more powerful, more beautiful than we are? That's what we are now thinking. Human beings think God's imagination must have exhausted itself before God made us. How can any being be more beautiful than us? But Aurobindo said, we are still in our infancy. The Vedas, if you really go to the Vedas, they describe a human being as a baby of 6 months. That shows how much more growth there is awaiting us. And this growth now is not anymore physical growth. This growth now is a different kind of growth. It's a growth at a different kind of level. It's a growth in consciousness. Now, how do you bring about growth in consciousness? You see, very often people wonder, India is supposed to be the guru of the world. Look at Indians. Look at the mess they have made of their own country. How can they ever be gurus of the world? India becomes the guru of the world doesn't mean Indians are gurus of the world. We have mistaken that. So I also come here and lecture and I am a guru. And if I wear saffron robes, they won't let me go back to India, I'm very sure. So we need you here, Swamiji, you stay on here. That's why I'm not saffron robes, because I want to go back to India. So that's the kind of thing that is happening here. And so, this whole thing, when Sri Aurobindo reviewed it, he said, we have come this far. From dead matter, we have come to the level of the mind. And mind is such a powerful thing. Fully developed mind is what distinguishes us from the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee and we have exactly the same body. The dimensions may be different, they have exactly the same thing. But no chimpanzee has ever learned the human language. Human beings don't need a tutor to learn their own language. A child born in India, no matter what his parentage is, if he is brought to America at the age of 18 months and allowed to exposed to American language, he will be the only man in the family, only person in the family who will speak American. I have gone to Indian families, people who have been here for 40 years. These Indians who come here, they bring India with them. And they continue to be Indians. But there is one voice, suddenly you hear American voice. Then I know what it is. It must be a child growing up here who has learned the American language, American accent, etc., etc. Now this language is something we try to learn after we go to school, and very few of us succeed. We have various kinds of training program, how to be a better language teacher, etc. And you have tuitions. But a human child needs no tuition. If he is brought up in Baroda, the child won't say, no, I come from Japanese stock, I only speak Japanese. He won't speak Japanese, he will speak Gujarati, because in Baroda he is exposed to Gujarati. So this mind, although it is just one step beyond the chimpanzee, has brought tremendous powers with it. One is the capacity to speak automatically, spontaneously, and American scientists have tried to teach language to chimpanzees. Psychologists have adapted chimpanzee babies. They have taken them to bed with them. They have taken them to the dining room with them. They have sung lullabies to them. They have read storybooks to them. They have done all kinds of things and finally gave up and saying the chimpanzee cannot learn a human language, even a sign language. That's because the chimpanzee doesn't have what we call the human consciousness. Man has something plus. Man is an animal plus something. And this something is also what has enabled us. The chimpanzee looks at the same world that you and I look at. But no chimpanzee ever has the capacity to do deduction and induction. And because of induction and deduction, we have been able to master science and technology. All this has been possible, but one level of consciousness called the mind. But mind has certain inadequacies, and this inadequacy being, mind always divides rather than unifies. That is why don't put three clever people together. They will end up quarreling. See, when you put people together, they will not find harmony. They will always find disharmony. This is the capacity of the human mind. The human mind cannot see the truth as a whole. Human mind has to take the truth, break into pieces, and look at each piece at a time. The human intellect is like those blind people who went groping for an elephant. And 7 blind people described the elephant in 7 different ways. Nobody was telling a lie. Everybody was telling a truth, but it was not the whole truth. So mind is like that. And mind also creates disharmony. And what Sri Aurobindo said is that from the mind, there is still another step. And for want of better word, he called it the supermind. And when that consciousness comes, that consciousness is evolved, we won't be less human for that. We'll be as human as we are now, but without this divisiveness, without this capacity to be lost in ignorance, without, everybody wants a man to change. And people have made attempts to change man. But so far, no program of changing man has succeeded. The only way changing human consciousness, that secret we had, India had, that is called yoga. Yoga is not standing on your head. Yoga is not giving lectures on the Upanishads and the Vedas. Yoga is honing your consciousness. Consciously, deliberately, step by step. Making it pure, making it wide, making it universal. Very often people ask me, oh, why is it God difficult to find out? I said, God is very easy to find out. Very easy. How do you find God? My answer, by becoming one. You have to be as vast as God. Then only you can understand God through identity. That's what our ancestors said. You become God. Then you can understand God through identity. So there is a level of consciousness awaiting to come down. The level of consciousness which is above the mind, which he called the supramental consciousness. And the art of training the consciousness, the art of gradually taking the consciousness step by step is called yoga. And Sri Aurobindo has very clearly said, just as in the age of the mind, induction and deduction proved so powerful, the next stage, yoga will be the most powerful mantra for the whole of humanity. Because the whole of humanity has to grow from the mind to the supramental consciousness. And this is not just what Sri Aurobindo has said. There is in the Christian tradition, the French Jesuit priest called Taillard, he said this. He wrote books about it. But the Christian church didn't allow him to publish his findings. He was not a yogi in Sri Aurobindo's mold, cast in Sri Aurobindo's mold. He was an honest Jesuit priest. He did his work in China. And he wrote books like The Phenomenon of Man and so on. He uses a slightly different terminology. But he also came to the same conclusion that but his terms are different. From mind to another level, man has to ascend before perfection can come to humanity. And how this will come and what kind of yoga has to be used for it,